Hey guys, so a whole ton of new set of polls have just been released for this year, including new polls from the most competitive Senate elections that we have. We're seeing some pretty surprising numbers from many of these races, and also from some of the less competitive elections that we have this year as well. We have two new polls with Mike Lee only leading within the margin of error against Evan McMullin, an independent candidate, and remember, Mike Lee won by 41% in 2016. We also have a new poll from Alaska showing Kelly Tshibaka and Lisa Murkowski in a completely tied race, and before the final round of ranked choice voting, Kelly Tshibaka leads in both the two preliminary rounds. But in this video, we're going to focus on the 5 most competitive Senate elections and the polls that we're seeing from these races. Of course, these 5 races are for the seats in Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And so even though we have some pretty tight races in states like Ohio, North Carolina, or New Hampshire, in the very end, they're not as likely to flip, not nearly as likely to flip as these 5 races. So in the very end, it's going to be Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada that ultimately decide the makeup of the U.S. Senate and whether or not Democrats will be able to maintain their majorities or if Republicans will take back control of the upper chamber of Congress. And so we're just going to get right into it, starting off with the race in Georgia. Currently, Raphael Warnock is ahead by 2.7 points against Herschel Walker, and he has seen a resurgence in support in just the last week. If you look at his margin against Walker just a few days ago, Warnock was only ahead by 1%. He's maintained this lead since the end of June and has done so pretty well. However, if you look at the 3 polls that were conducted entirely in August, Raphael Warnock was behind in every single one of them. All 3 of the August polls showed Herschel Walker leading. And so for a while, it looked like Republicans may have had a pretty good chance in this race. However, as of right now, Democrats' odds in Georgia are higher than they've been in a very long time. According to the 538 forecast, Raphael Warnock right now has a 55% chance at winning his re-election. Of course, this is still very, very close, but if you look at how his odds have changed, Warnock's odds really have never been higher at all. At the very beginning, when this forecast was first released in June, Herschel Walker had a 62% chance at flipping the seat. Now he is no longer even the favored candidate. And another major issue for Republicans is they can't just point to the polls in Georgia and say that they're going to be wrong. Polls in Georgia have been known to be accurate. If you look at polls in other states, yes, Democrats almost always underperform expectations, but Georgia is not one of those states. If John Fetterman was leading by 2.7% against Mehmet Oz, in Pennsylvania, it would be a very close race, but Warnock up by 2.7 in Georgia really means that he does have a pretty significant advantage. In the 2020 presidential election, Joe Biden was expected to carry the state by 1.2%. In the very end, he won by 0.2%. A 1-point difference is absolutely insignificant. If you look at the runoff elections in 2021, Jon Ossoff was expected to defeat David Perdue by 1.8%. He won by exactly 1 point. And in the special election, Warnock was expected to win by 2.1%. And of course, in the very end, this poll was famously accurate. He defeated Kelly Loeffler by a margin exactly 2%, as the polls are only wrong by 0.1%. And so this really goes to show you that Herschel Walker truly is in trouble right now. This was his race to lose. For a very long time, he was expected to win. At one point, he even had a 6-point lead in the polls, but now he's down by 3. And if you look closely at the 3 polls that were conducted last month, you'll see that one of them was conducted by the Trafalgar Group, and of course, they are known for being a major right-wing pollster. They had Herschel Walker leading by 1%. A 1-point lead for any Republican, according to this pollster, is a pretty insignificant margin. According to this poll, Walker only was ahead by 1 point in Georgia. That probably means, honestly, that he was losing in this race because the Trafalgar Group is known for heavily oversampling GOP voters. And if you look at the 2018 poll for the governor election, this was the final poll released for the gubernatorial election in Georgia between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. They had Brian Kemp winning by 12 points. In the very end, Kemp would only win the state by 1.4. So that just goes to show you how inaccurate the Trafalgar Group can be, with an example from the state of Georgia just 4 years ago in the previous midterm year. And so based on everything we're seeing in Georgia right now overall, this race is going to be very, very competitive. Herschel Walker is going to be boosted by the national environment. The fact that Donald Trump is no longer the president is going to help him significantly, but Joe Biden's negative impact is not as significant as Republicans would have hoped. And if you look at every single political source for this election, they predict that this race is going to be a pure toss-up. So Georgia really is going to be a very, very close race. 530 does give Warnock a slight advantage. If you look at their forecast based on polls alone, Warnock has a 68% chance at winning. If you go back to the Lux model right now, Raphael Warnock is expected to win 49.9% of the vote. Of course, candidates in Georgia have to win a majority or they will face face a runoff election. So if Warnock does not get to 50%, he will have to run again in January of 2023. And so right now on our map, I'm going to fill in Georgia as a tilt Democratic state. I think this race is still going to be very, very close, but as of right now, I think that going into the month of October, Raphael Warnock does have a very slight advantage. Now, before we move on to Arizona, I do want to look at this new page that 538 has put out. I've gone on the page a few times before. Basically, what this shows you is the chances that both parties have at winning the Senate if you fill in some races. So right now, I have not a single race called, but if I just give Democrats the race in Georgia with Warnock winning re-election, Democrats will have a 90% chance at winning the Senate overall. So Georgia really is going to be one of the most important elections of this year. And the reason why chance of Democrats to go up so much is that if Democrats can win in Georgia, they're probably going to hold on to Arizona and then most likely flip Pennsylvania as well. So if that can happen in Georgia, if Democrats can win in this state, they're probably going to win in many other races. And so that's why Georgia has such a significant effect on the overall chances for the Democratic Party. And now moving on to Arizona, Mark Kelly maintains an 8.6% lead in the polls against Blake Masters. His lead actually dipped down to just 6.1% just a couple of days ago, but it has gone up in a similar way that we saw the numbers go for Warnock. And so if you do look at the two most recent polls, Mark Kelly has led by 20 and 21 points. We also saw two new polls from Inside Advantage and Emerson College, both showing Mark Kelly in the lead. And if you look at the overall spread of polls, Mark Kelly has led in every single one of them. No Republicans has even come close to leading in a poll against the incumbent Democrat. Even Doug Ducey, the governor of Arizona, of course, he did not run for this election, but even in a hypothetical situation in which Ducey would be the Republican nominee, he still lost to Mark Kelly by 3%. So that's just how popular of an incumbent Mark Kelly is. Arizona is not any bluer of a state than Georgia. Both states only flipped Democrat in a presidential election in 2020, and of course that was by 0.2% in both of these states. Arizona is actually up to 0.3%, but Joe Biden was the first Democrat to win both of these states in a presidential race since the Clinton era, and so none of these states are blue by any means. They're very purple states, and so right now we're seeing that Mark Kelly's popularity is what's making Arizona so much less competitive than Georgia. However, despite Mark Kelly being a strong candidate, he still did severely underperform polling expectations in 2020. 2 years ago, Mark Kelly was expected to win by a pretty likely margin. However, in the end, he would only defeat Martha McSally by 2.3%. So it was a surprisingly close race, despite many of the final polls having him up by double-digit margins. He still did lead in every single one of the polls. The polls were still ultimately correct, but Mark Kelly did not win by as large of a margin as many of the polls had suggested. However, this was a presidential election year, and polls are known for being more off in presidential years. If you go back to 2018, this was the last midterm year. Arizona saw the election between Kyrsten Sinema and Martha McSally, the same McSally that lost to Mark Kelly in 2020. And so at this point, McSally was not the incumbent senator, but just a representative from the state. And so these polls were much more accurate. McSally led in many of the final polls. Sinema did as well, and in the very end, Kyrsten Sinema would win by the exact same margin, defeating McSally by a margin of 2.3%. Becoming a first-term U.S. Senator. And turning to the 538 forecast, Arizona is a likely Democratic state. That's the same category that Colorado is placed in, with Michael Bennet having a 91% chance at defeating Joe Hedaya. But in Arizona, Mark Kelly has a 79% chance at winning his re-election. So basically a 4 in 5 chance that Mark Kelly is going to win. Blake Masters' odds were at 42% at one point. Now he only has a 21% chance at winning. So this race went from being pretty competitive to a race the Democrats have a very significant advantage in. And this is before, if you look at this forecast based solely on the polls, if you look at the light model of this forecast, you'll see that Mark Kelly has a 91% chance at winning his re-election to a first full term. So Arizona has quickly become one of the most lopsided races in favor of the Democratic Party. I mean, just look at the list of all the races. There's so many races now that are more competitive than Arizona, even though it should be one of the most important elections. Wisconsin, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, and Ohio right now are all more competitive than the race we have between Blake Masters and Mark Kelly in Arizona. And so as of this point in time, I do have Arizona as a lean Democratic state. Mark Kelly is probably going to win his re-election, but is not completely guaranteed. Blake Masters is still a Republican in a state that has a very long history of voting for Republican candidates. I mean, just look at the 2018 gubernatorial election. Doug Ducey won by 14%. So Republicans, it is not impossible for them to win. Mark Kelly is simply running a very strong campaign, and that's why I think he is going to win. So looking at how the odds change for both parties with this Arizona call, Democrats' odds go up to 95%. If Democrats win Arizona, and Georgia, they will have a 95% chance at winning the Senate. If we remove the call from Georgia and they only win Arizona, that's the only call we're going to make, Democrats still have an 82% chance at maintaining their Senate majority. Next up, in Wisconsin, the fact that we're even talking about this race shows you that Republicans have lost the advantage that they had initially going into the midterms. So if you do look at the 538 forecast right now, Wisconsin is expected to be the closest election of the year. Every single race will go to a candidate by a larger margin than Wisconsin is going to go to Ron Johnson, at least according to the 538 forecast. Wisconsin right now is expected to be closer than Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, and many of these very competitive races. And for a very long time, Ron Johnson was expected to win re-election pretty easily, but that clearly is no longer the case. For a long while, he was behind in the polls by 4 points. At this point, it looked like Mandela Barnes had a pretty good chance at flipping the seat. However, the 3 most recent polls have shown Ron Johnson in the lead, and that's why Barnes' margin has dipped down to just 1.1 points. If you look at the 3 most recent polls, Ron Johnson has led in all 3 of them, but only by 1%, and 2 of them were conducted by Marquette with 2 different samples, one with registered voters and one with just likely voters. Now, these polling numbers aren't exactly bad for Ron Johnson. He still is leading, and that's a significant improvement from where he was before. Mandela Barnes led in every single poll up until these 3 newest ones, but Ron Johnson only won re-election in 2016 by 3.4% against Russ Feingold. Feingold was expected to win the race. He was leading in most of the polls, but Johnson still pulled out a surprise victory. In 2022, he is still going to be vulnerable, even though he does have a pretty good chance at winning. In 2022, he is much more unpopular than he was 6 years ago. Ron Johnson, of course, tried to overturn the 2020 presidential election results in a state that Joe Biden won in that same election. So Ron Johnson is really not that popular of a senator. He is not liked by a significant chunk of the independent electorate in his state, but the fact that Joe Biden is not doing that great as president is probably the biggest boost right now to the Ron Johnson campaign. And so the polls in Wisconsin have been known to not exactly be the greatest, and that's why these 1-point leads are still pretty significant. If Ron Johnson can lead in at least half to most of the polls in the final weeks leading up to the election, he has a very good shot at winning a 3rd term. And the best example of polls being wrong in Wisconsin is from the 2020 presidential election. Joe Biden was expected to win this race by 8.4% against Donald Trump. He led in every single poll released in the weeks before the election, and by double digits in many of those polls. Even the most Republican polls had Joe Biden winning the state. But in the very end, Biden only carried Wisconsin by 0.63%. I mean, that is a significantly smaller margin than what the polls had suggested, almost 8% of an underperformance for Joe Biden in 2020. 2016, Donald Trump won Wisconsin by a larger margin than the current president. So that's just how wrong polls have been in Wisconsin. That's really the only example you need to get a perspective on the fact that Mandela Barnes winning by 1% right now in Wisconsin really is not significant at all. I mean, here's the polling numbers for 2022. A 1.1% lead is no guarantee at all the Democrats are even that competitive in Wisconsin. But Trump was on the ballot, and so the Trump effect is known for causing Trump's support to be underestimated in polls especially. And so in 2022, a midterm year, Mandela Barnes is probably not going to underperform as severely as Joe Biden did 2 years ago. But Ron Johnson right now is still in a pretty good position, considering the fact that in 2016, he was doing worse in the polls against Russ Feingold, who was a former U.S. Senator. So as of this point in time, I do have Wisconsin as a lean Republican state. The 538 forecast, though, does seem to disagree with me. They have Wisconsin as a toss-up. According to their forecast, Wisconsin is the closest election of the year, as I said before, according to them. Ron Johnson only has a 57% chance of winning. I mean, that is remarkably small. Mandela Barnes at 43, and if you look at how the numbers have changed, there really has been a drastic shift. At one point, Ron Johnson had a 77% chance at winning. This race has gone from being a likely Republican state all the way down now to being a pure toss-up. Ron Johnson, as of this point in time, is only expected to win by a margin of 1.2%. That is just how close this race is going to be. I think that Ron Johnson is not going to win by over 5%, but I think that around 2 to 4% is still likely for the GOP incumbent. And so if we come back here and give Republicans Wisconsin, their chances at winning do jump up to 11, even though we've already called both Georgia and Arizona. So at this point, the Senate majority is going to rely on whether Democrats can flip Pennsylvania or hold on to Nevada. So our map right now is more competitive than ever. 49 for Democrats, 49 for Republicans, and of course the race in Georgia is only a tilt race, so it can realistically go both ways. Pennsylvania and Nevada, I think, are going to be 2 of the most defining races of the year. here. I think that Arizona and Wisconsin, they're pretty easily going to go to either party, but Pennsylvania is going to be difficult simply because it's going to be a flip for Democrats with John Fetterman defeating Mehmet Oz if they do indeed win that race. And of course, Nevada is a state that is not shifting to the left at all. It is seeing an increase in support for Republicans, especially as Latinos turn away from the Democratic Party. And so in the Keystone State, John Fetterman is absolutely crushing Mehmet Oz. Mehmet Oz has been behind in every single poll released for this election, just like Mark Kelly is leading over Blake Masters in every single poll in Arizona. Right now, the polling average in Pennsylvania stands at 10.2 in favor of John Fetterman, and if you look at the spread here, the two most recent polls have shown Fetterman up by 5 and Fetterman up by 21%. In 2016, Pat Toomey did win his re-election. It was a pretty surprising win, as Katie McGinty did lead in all of the final polls. Toomey only won by 1.4%, but he was also not as down in the polls as Mehmet Oz is in right now. The margin for Katie McGinty was significantly smaller than the margin is right now for John Fetterman. A 10-point margin, it means that John Fetterman is almost guaranteed to win this race. It would be very unlikely that he loses, despite leading in every single poll. And this should be very worrying for the GOP, as of course this is a seat that they currently hold. If Democrats can flip a seat this year, it'll make it much more difficult for Republicans to win back Senate control if they can't even hold on to the seats that they currently have. The 5:30 forecast has Pennsylvania right now as the most solid race out of all 5 that we're going to look at today. John Fetterman has an 83% chance at winning his first term. Mehmet Oz is only at 17%, and the shift here has been more significant than for any other race on the map. Of course, this is a state currently held by Republicans. That's why Oz's chances were so high at the beginning. At one point just 3 months ago, Mehmet Oz had a 65% chance at defeating John Fetterman. Now he has less of a chance at winning Pennsylvania than Tim Ryan does in Ohio. Tim Ryan in the Buckeye State has a 30% chance at defeating J.D. Vance, but in Pennsylvania, a much more purple state, Mehmet Oz only has a 17% chance at winning, and according to 538's forecast based on polls alone, Mehmet Oz has a stunning 7% chance at winning. John Fetterman is here at 93%. John Fetterman really is running a very strong campaign. That's why he's doing so well in the polls. And the fact that Mehmet Oz really has nothing to do with Pennsylvania, he's never lived there, never had anything to do with the state, that's not going to help him in November either. And so at this point, I'm obviously going to give Pennsylvania to the Democrats, but I will only give it a lean classification. I don't think Pennsylvania is going to be a likely Democratic state. Even though John Fetterman is leading in the polls, Democrats do underperform expectations in Pennsylvania. I think a 5-point margin is possible for the lieutenant governor, but I think the margin is going to be somewhere around 4 to 5%, slightly more solid blue than Arizona, but still a win and a flip for Democrats nonetheless, and that's what they care about. So as of right now, the numbers are looking good for Democrats, even though it can still be very, very competitive. So going back to the page here where we have the chances for both parties, I'm going to fill in Pennsylvania as a state that will go to John Fetterman, and after this change, Democrats will have a 93% chance at maintaining control. And finally, in Nevada, we do have just one new poll, so we're going to pretty quickly cover this race. Masto is running for re-election against Adam Laxalt. Categories Masto was first elected in 2016, and the most recent poll does show Adam Laxalt up by a margin of 1%. This poll was conducted by Emerson College, an A- rated pollster, but Laxalt still is down in the polling average by a margin of 2.9 points to the Democratic incumbent. Now, what's interesting is that this is the first independent poll that Laxalt has been ahead in since all the way back in April. The last time that Adam Laxalt led in an independent funded poll was when he was up by 3% against Masto all the way back on the 2nd of April, and this poll was conducted by the B+ rated Suffolk University. Before this, Laxalt was doing pretty well against Masto. He did lead in most of the polls, that's why he had the advantage if you go back a couple of months, but now Masto has maintained a relatively strong lead for the last couple of months, especially during the summer. 538 has Nevada as a lean Democratic state, with Masto having a 61% chance at winning, and so her odds are basically higher than they have ever been, and they currently project a margin of victory of 2% for the Democrat who's seeking a second term. And so I will make Nevada slightly closer. I have Nevada as a tilt Democratic state on my map right now. I do think that in both Nevada and Georgia, Republicans have a very good chance, but the Democratic incumbents here are pretty strong and have a very slight advantage. So in the end, I don't think Democrats are for sure going to win 51 states, but with Democrats having an advantage in both Nevada and Georgia, they are going into these midterms in a position of strength. And so that'll be it for this video. I'm going to cover the Alaska race in a couple of days. I think that this new poll really is very interesting, showing Chewbacca and Murkowski in an even race. 530 has even made it so that Kelly Chewbacca has a 69% chance at winning this election. I think that's going to be completely wrong, and I'll go over this election again in just a couple of days. But that'll be it for this one. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to like it down below if you're new. To comment down below which party you think will win a majority in the Senate, and how do you feel about these new polls? Do you think Ron Johnson will win re-election in Wisconsin? Do you think Democrats will be able to hold on to their seats in Nevada and Georgia? Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in the next video.